All right, friends. So in this second part of the lecture, we're going to learn about counterplans. Right? What is a counterplan? So it's exactly like what it sounds like, right? And it's oftentimes abbreviated to CP, but a counterplan is the alternative plan to the affirmatives that will usually solve for all or parts of the affirmative's harms, right? So the affirmative has a plan of action. The counterplan says, I have a better idea for solving the problem that the 1AC describes. So it's a counter to the plan, a counterplan, exactly like what it sounds. So in debate, it's necessary to have for the negative to have the option for counterplans, right? Because there are some things in the status quo that occur that are indefensible, like police brutality, or racism, or sexism, or homophobia, right? These are practices that are widespread but are not really defendable in debate because they're terrible practices. They're not based in any kind of ethical system that makes sense, right? So, instead of debating about whether or not these things are good or bad, right, we introduce counterplans so that we can have debates about the best way to solve the problem without having to disagree about what the problem is. Additionally, the negative team can't just say that there is another way to solve the problem, right? But they have to have a reason why the counterplan is a better idea than the plan, right? Whether that be through a disadvantage to the plan that the counterplan doesn't link to, or whether it be through a debate on the case about what the plan is capable of accomplishing and what the counterplan might accomplish in comparison to that. But the negative team must have a reason why the counterplan is better than the plan, not simply something that could also be good, right? So like I just said, counterplans have a traditional structure, right? So first, we always have the counterplan text. Just like there's a plan text that states what the policy that the app is going to be defending states what it is, the counterplan is also going to state in its text what its policy is, what it's going to do, and it's going to write it out in some way. It could be the United States federal government should do this or that, or maybe it has a different actor do what the plan says should happen, or there's a variety of different counterplans. But we'll get to that in a minute. But the text lays out, much like the plan text, what the counterplan does. The counterplan also should have a solvency advocate, right? So it should have a piece of evidence from someone who says that, just like the affirmative has a piece of evidence from someone who says that their federal government should do the plan, right? The counterplan should have a piece of evidence that says that whoever is doing the counterplan should do whatever the action of the counterplan is, right? You need, in the literature, someone that says that we should do what the counterplan says. We shouldn't just be making up random assertions, although it's not to say that you can't be creative and think of your own possible solutions, right? It's just that important that we have evidence to back up why we think our plans will solve the problems that we've identified. You can also include a statement about competition, which isn't always necessary, right? But this competition refers to mutual exclusivity, which we'll talk about in just a second. But basically, to say that the counterplan and the plan cannot happen at the same time; they're competitive with one another. And then finally, you have to include the net benefit, right? And this could be a dissent on a different page, right? It doesn't always have to be like in the counterplan, right? But this is the thing. The reason why the counterplan is a better idea than the plan, right? And usually this takes the form of a disadvantage to the plan, something that the plan does that causes that's bad, but the counterplan doesn't do the same thing, right? It doesn't do whatever the plan did that was bad. It does other things, right? So it's a dissent that links to the plan, but it does not link to the counterplan because it's not connected to the counterplan. And those are called net benefits because it proves that when you add it all up, if both the plan and the counterplan solve the aff, but the counterplan avoids the dissent and the plan doesn't, then costs and benefits, it's net benefit to the counterplan. You should vote for the counterplan in that instance. Okay, so I just referenced this, but mutual exclusivity is also a very important part of counterplans and counterplan debating, right? So the counterplan must prove that it is mutually exclusive with the plan. So the words mutually exclusive mean in particular that both things cannot occur at the same time, right? If they're exclusive or they exclude one another, they can't happen at the same time. If it's mutual, then it means both of them exclude one another, that there's no possibility of compromise. So there are two ways that the negative team can go about proving that the counterplan is competitive or that it has mutual exclusivity with the plan. First, it can be functional, right? There can be functional mutual exclusivity or functional competition. So let's say that the Packet app has a plan, right, that increases funding to the police in order to have implicit bias training, right? That training would cost money, and it would increase that funding in order to do that training, right, and fund those programs. Well, let's say that the negative team reads a counter plan that says we're going to abolish the police. We're going to totally get rid of them. No more funding, zero funding. We're going to reduce all the funding to the police. They're not going to exist anymore. Those things are functionally mutually exclusive because you cannot both give money to the police and get rid of the police at the same time, right? So that's functional mutual exclusivity, that the two things literally cannot occur at the same time, right? But it could also be established through net benefits, right? Just as the link to the plan, but not the counterplan. So let's say that the plan has the federal government institute and pay for implicit bias training, right? Then a counterplan that has the state governments do the same thing, right? From the same type of bias training, but at the state level instead of the federal level, right? That's not functionally mutually exclusive. Like, it is possible to imagine a world where the federal government and the state governments both fund implicit bias training programs, right? But it could be, competition could be established through a net benefit, where if there's a real big disadvantage of the federal government doing that, whether that be related to questions of federalism or political questions of maybe the election, versus having the state governments do it without federal intervention, right? If you can establish, that it would be way better for the states to do it than the federal government to do it, because of the net benefit. And that's also a reason why they're competitive. It's also a reason why the judge should prefer the counter plan over the plan, or even over a combination of the two, because including the plan unnecessarily risks the disadvantage when the counter plan alone would be enough to solve the affirmative. So that's mutual exclusivity, and that will be relevant when we talk about the permutation, when we talk about answering the counterplans, we'll talk about in just a minute. But before we get there, we're going to talk about a few types of counterplans. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are also other types of counterplans that exist as well, but this is a few of the more common counterplans that you'll find and run across in debate. So first we have advantage counterplans, which are counterplans that do a different action to solve the harms of the 1AC rather than the plans. Let's say that the AFIT gets up and is like, the police are over-aggressive and they're very violent, and we think doing this implicit bias training would help with that problem, help solve that problem, right? An advantage counterplan might be, instead of doing implicit bias training, let's do this other thing. Let's institute a nationwide duty to intervene policy, right? It's a totally different policy. It's attempted to address the same thing of, right, police violence, right? But it's a different policy. So it's called an advantage counterplan because it solves the advantage without doing the plan. So then if you had a particular reason why this bias training was bad, you could say that would be the net benefit, right? Is that bias training is bad, it is bad for X, Y, and Z reasons. We can do these other policies in order to resolve the impact that the affirmative is talking about, right? That's an advantage counterplan. Then you have what's called agent counterplans, right? So this is a counterplan that does the action of the plan, but it has a different agent do it, right? So this is what we were talking about earlier in terms of like a counterplan that has the state governments do the plan instead of the federal government. Or if you have a plan that's about localities, right? Like the city governments have, or like the police organizations, right? You change the agent of the plan and have some other agent do it instead of the federal government, right? And the affirmative always has to defend that the federal government is the key actor for their plan, right? And I already kind of explained what a potential net benefit scenario would be there, right? And then finally, there are also plan inclusive counterplans, or what's known as PICs, which stands for plan inclusive counterplans. So it does most of the affirmative, but it excludes, all or parts of the but excludes all or parts of it, right? So instead of saying, or excludes one or more parts of what the affirmative is doing. So let's say the F says, we're going to do implicit bias training across the board, right? You might want to have a counterplan that says, well, we should do implicit bias training except in like these 3 states because they already have implicit bias training programs that are working and there would be a disadvantage in terms of funding. How are we going to fund the money? Like, why would we waste money doing a double training, double funding the same program, right, for the police, right? So you might have a pick that says, we'll do most of the training program for the affirmative, but maybe we don't want to do it in these parts, or we don't want to do this particular part of the implicit bias training program because we have a problem with it, but we want to do the other parts of it, right? So that's what a plan implicit counterplan is. It takes the plan and it says most of this is good except for this one part. This one part is bad. So we're going to advocate to do all the rest of the plan without this one thing that we have a problem with. Now, there are a couple other counterplans as well, so I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but generally these are some of the more common counterplans that you might run into. Yeah, plan implicit counterplans. Sorry, I didn't have the text up. It's there now for you to read, but it does most of the plan, but excludes one or more part of the affirmative. So those are called picks. If you run a pick, it's also called picking out of whatever part of the affirmative you're doing as a verb, just as a fun fact. If you ever hear someone say that, oh, they were picking out of this thing, then it means that they ran a plan inclusive counterplan that said do all of the plan except for that one thing. So it can also be used as a verb. Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the status of the counterplan. This is kind of a complicated concern, right? But this is related to whether or not the negative team is stuck advocating the counterplan, right? So if you're affirmative, right, and you pick your plan, you have to advocate that plan the entire debate. You can never, when you're F, you always have to say, we should do this implicit bias training. We should do this plan. We should do all parts of the plan. It should be the federal government that's doing it. You can't kick out of or stop advocating for the plan. You have to advocate the plan the whole time. Now, counterplans, right, are not the same, right? Because remember, the affirmative's job is to prove that the plan is a good idea, or is to prove that an example of the resolution is a good idea. The negative's job is to just disprove that the affirmative's plan is a good idea, right? So if the affirmative proves that the negative's counterplan is a bad idea, that does not necessarily prove that the affirmative's plan is a good idea. As a result, the negative is not stuck in the same way that the affirmative is stuck to the plan. So the affirmative has to advocate their plan the entire debate. The negative team can say, no, you're right. We agree with whatever concerns you had about the counterplan. We're no longer advocating for the counterplan. We're either advocating for this other counterplan that we had going on, or advocating for this alternative advocacy that we have on this other page, or we're just going to simply go back to advocating for the status quo. You're right, the counterplan was a bad idea, but the status quo is still a better idea than the affirmative. Doing nothing is better than the affirmative, right? And that idea is called conditionality, right? That there are no conditions under which the counterplan, the negative team has to advocate it, or rather, the negative team is only conditionally advocating the plan. As long as the conditions are met where the negative team thinks that it's strategically beneficial to advocate for the counterplan, they'll do that, but they're free to kick it whenever. They're free to say, no, you're right, we don't think this efficacy was good, we were just testing it out, let's talk about this other stuff instead. So almost always counterplans are run this way. They're run conditionally. And that means that the negative can stop advocating for them at any time and either advocate for the status quo or a different advocacy instead. Now, sometimes the affirmative team might object to conditionality, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but it's not really feasible, right? Judges won't vote for the argument that all conditional arguments are bad anymore. But instead, right, affirmatives might say having multiple conditional counterplans, like, yeah, you're right, maybe you should always be able to revert back to the status quo, but you don't get to test out 3, 4, 5 policies against us, right? You have to pick your policy and defend it against the plan or defend the status quo, right? So there are theoretical objections, right, where affirmative teams might say you don't get to have 2 or 3 or 4 counterplans that are conditional, you can only have 1. Right. You might also hear references to things like unconditionality or dispositionality, but you should not be worried about those things. Counterplans are never actually run that way in like literally 99% of cases. So it's not super important. Unconditionally just means that the negative has to defend the counterplan in the same way that the affirmative has to defend the plan. And then dispositionally, no one knows what it means. There's about 17 different definitions. So it's kind of meaningless, so don't worry about it at all. All right, so we're going to put our affirmative hats back on for just a minute, and we're going to talk a little bit about answering the counterplan. So I'm just going to go through a list of some arguments that you should make in the 2AC to answer the counterplan, and we'll explain what each one is. So first, you should always make a perm argument, or a permutation, not a perm like curly hair, right, but a permutation, right, which is a mathematical term that basically means a combination, right? So you always want to say permutation, do both, right? We can do the plan and the counterplan at the same time. We can have the federal government fund implicit bias training, and we can have the state government's fund implicit bias training at the same time, right? So this is an argument that the counterplan is not mutually exclusive. It's not competitive with the affirmative, that we could do both at the same time, and it would be, even better. That right? So the negative team has to win not only that the counterplan is better than the plan, but also that the counterplan by itself, right, is better than a combination of the counterplan and the plan, or that the combination is impossible, right? So the permutation is an argument that tests the competition or the mutual exclusivity of the counterplan, and it's the affirmative team saying, I don't think that these two things are exclusive or competitive. I think that they could happen at the same time, right? And you can also make arguments about why the combination of doing both at the same time might affect, for example, the link to the net benefit. You might say that if we had the state government and the federal government do it at the same time, then that would assuage any of the federalism concerns on the net benefit. So it would shield the link to the net benefit because they would both be acting, so it wouldn't seem like an imposition of the federal government or whatever the particular argument may be, right? But you want to say these two things can happen at the same time. There's nothing stopping it. And it would be better to do both of them than it would to be just the counterplan. So the affirmative gets the benefit of being able to say that we should do both, while the negative has to say that we should only do the counterplan. The affirmative does not have to say we should only do the plan. The affirmative can say we should do both at the same time. That's the permutation. Next, you should always have offense against the counterplan, right? So there are a couple ways you can get offense against the counterplan. First, you can read a disad to the counterplan that doesn't link to the plan, just like they have read a disad to the plan that doesn't link to the counterplan. So let's say you're debating the state's counterplan. You could say, well, having the state government's do a plan would be a bad idea for X, Y, and Z reasons. It might affect this state election, or it might affect this other thing that's going on in this other state, right? So you can have a disadvantage to the counterplan, but if the feds were to do it, you wouldn't link to that disadvantage, right? So you can do the same thing right back at them in the 2AC. Say, we have thought about this, and we have a disadvantage to having your counterplan happen that the app doesn't link to. You can also read an add-on, which is a fancy term for just kind of like a short advantage, right? Like one, maybe two cards, right? Two pieces of evidence, a small, tiny advantage that's distinct from the 1AC advantage. So let's say in the 1AC you were talking about over-policing, and maybe you're talking about terrorism, right? So in the 2AC you might want to say, hey, also, the plan would reduce gun violence, would reduce gun crimes and such, right? So it's distinct because it's not about over-policing, it's not about terrorism, it's a new thing, but it's a new advantage to the 1AC that the counterplan might not solve if it doesn't do anything that can address gun violence, right? So you can read an add-on that the counterplan doesn't solve, so it's a new advantage, right? And then you can also argue that the counterplan links to the net benefit, right? Like if all of the state governments were to institute this criminal justice reform, that might have just as much an effect on the election than if the federal government were to do it, right? So you can make an argument that the counterplan has the same link argument to the net benefit that the plan does. All right. Next, you want to contest solvency, right? So you want to have reasons why the counterplan doesn't solve the affirmative advantages. So you can use those advantages as disadvantages to the counterplan. So if the counterplan can't solve, let's say that it's the state's counterplan, the states, they don't got the money. They can't do implicit bias training because it won't be uniform. In some of the more racist states, they'll continue being racist and their training will be a joke. They simply can't afford to do it, right? You need the expertise from the federal government, right? So you just like, they don't solve the affirmative. It doesn't solve the affirmative. Only the federal government has the capacity to solve the affirmative, right? Or you can have other reasons, right? Like if it's an advantage counterplan, you have reasons why their policy doesn't work, right? Or if it's a pick, you should have reasons why the thing that they said was bad is actually good, and why solving that would be a good idea, right? But if you can prove that the counterplan doesn't solve your advantage, right, then that's similar to net benefit for the plan, right? So instead of being a disad that the plan links to that the counterplan doesn't link to, this is an advantage that the plan solves that the counterplan doesn't solve. You can still compare those things to one another, because the advantage would still happen in the world of the counterplan alone. Finally, you can make a theoretical objection to the counterplan. Right? So this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of conditionality, where you can say, hey, you don't get multiple counterplans, or you don't get to say that all 50 state governments are going to act in the same way at the same time, right? And object to the type of fiat that they have, or the type of counterplan that they have, right? Or you can say that reading multiple conditional counterplans is bad, and they should only be able to read one conditional counterplan. So you can object to the debate practice, right, rather than objecting to the counterplan itself, right? So instead of saying like the state government is ineffective, you could say the negative team should not be able to advocate for the state governments to work this way, right? So when you're answering the counterplan, you should say perm. You should have some offensive arguments for why the counterplan is a bad idea. You should say it doesn't solve the affirmative, and you can have a theoretical objection as well about why they shouldn't get the fiat that they get, or why they shouldn't be able to read multiple counterplans. I hope that was helpful, and I hope you all know a little bit more about counterplans.